Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. The good news is we are back online for live streaming. It's on again. And then our next speaker, we have only 2 speakers for this session and we'll conclude our program. So the first speaker is Martin Flato. Is going to talk to us about the impact of climate variability on female-headed households in South Africa. He's from the University of Oslo in Norway.
Thank you. Yes, in Norway. Thank you. So I'm going to present a very half-done work on the impact of climate variability on female-headed households in South Africa. What we know about climate variability is that it's gonna we're gonna see more of it in the future, and that's particularly the case in Africa. What is less known is which groups in society stand to gain or lose from this climate variability. But that is increasingly being studied. And different groups in society that could gain or lose from climate variability are groups based on gender, or class, or other dimensions. This question of who will gain or lose due to climate variability is an important question for 2 reasons. For policy reasons, if we know which households that are the most vulnerable, then maybe policies can be designed to protect these groups. And also from an equity point of view, if we want to assess whether we think that these costs are fairly distributed or not, and if we want to estimate how much different groups should then perhaps be compensated, then we need to know how different groups are affected. So the aim of this study is to investigate the existence, the extent, and the causes of differential vulnerability of female-headed households to climate variability in South Africa. And now there's a global demand for studies on the gendered impact of weather events. In both the last IPCC reports, there have been lengthy sections of how weather events affect women especially, and particular groups of women. However, most of these studies that are cited by the IPCC, they tend to consider specific subgroups or specific events. And although that is interesting, we also want to know how vast groups in the population are affected by climate variability and how they're affected by the sort of climate variability that we will see from year to year. So there are some population-wide quantitative studies of vulnerability of female-headed households, but very often these studies rely on either repeated cross-sections or even worse, on single cross-sections. And the problem with using repeated cross-sections for this analysis is that if you observe a change from one point in time to the next, you don't actually know whether it's due to the vulnerability of this group or whether it's due to changes in household formations or household breakups. Thus, the gold standard in this line of research is to use panel data. So data where the same household is interviewed several times. The problem, though, is that panel data is hard to get. There are a few panel data sets available. Hence, we've only found 4 studies who have used panel data to assess the vulnerability of female-headed households. And as you can see, these studies are quite diverse, both in the country that they study and in what sort of vulnerability they study. So the innovation of this study is that we use climate variability to study this question of whether these female-headed households are vulnerable. And that's also a particularly nice income shock to study, as it sort of comes from the blue rather than being determined by the humans on the ground. So this research also relates to research on South Africa and seeks to contribute to that. There are previous studies on female-headed households in South Africa, which have found that they are generally poorer than male-headed households, about twice as poor, and that they're also more vulnerable to fall into poverty. On the differential impact of climate variability, there hasn't yet been a population-wide study like this one, but there have been case studies, one from Eastern Cape and one from Limpopo, that both indicate that female-headed households are particularly vulnerable to climate variability. So let me now reflect on what we mean by these female-headed households. So traditionally, the head of households is determined simply by asking the people in the household to point to one of the restaurants as the head. And that concept is a bit problematic, because we then don't know why the household appoints a woman as the head and not a man. That can be because they lack productive men in this household, or it can be other reasons why she is wearing the pants in this household. Another problematic thing with this traditional concept of headship is that it assumes that all families can be neatly organized in a hierarchy with one boss and the other members following. And those of us who are married know that that's not always too easy to do. But what's good about this concept of female-headed households is that at its best it captures the notion that gender marginalization may depend on household composition. And that's why we find it useful that studying gender and household composition together is different from studying these two factors apart from each other. But responding to this criticism, we will use an objective definition of female headship. We define demographic headship as having at least one and only female resident adult members, and then working headship as having one and only female workers. And then we have a combined headship term, which are households that fall into either of these two groups. So now that that's defined, I'll speak a bit about these different mechanisms why we think that female-headed households are more vulnerable to climate variability than other households. So I made a mind map, and the main reason is probably because they're poorer, and we know that poor people are more vulnerable to climate variability. However, there may also be reasons why female-headed households are more vulnerable beyond the fact that they're poorer. One group of factors relate to that these households are headed by women, and that women are generally more likely to work in the informal sector, more likely to work in subsistence agriculture, and also if they have employment, the jobs are typically less secure. Another group of factors that come into play here is that these households lack men. And men may have access to the powerful, more powerful networks. That's what these case studies point to. And through these networks, they might have access to resources that the female-headed households don't have access to. Also, having two incomes rather than one means that you have a more diversified income portfolio. The third line of reasoning here is about the dependents. Female-headed households have a larger number of dependents compared to workers than other households, and they also have closer ties to their dependents. These ties and these caretaking responsibilities that the female heads often have for their dependents, it can also make them less mobile and less time flexible. And thus, some of the coping strategies available to male-headed households are not available for them. So with climate variability, we're going to use a relative rainfall measure. This measure is created by making a gamma distribution of rainfall, which falls during the rainy season each year between 1979 and 2013. This is done for every district. The nice thing about this measure is that each district then has the same probability of receiving this relative rainfall. So that's a nice thing. But we would also like a measure not only to have nice properties, but also to be relevant, to have a measure which actually impacts people on the ground. And to assess that, we are the first to use the agricultural stress index at the district level for South Africa. This is a measure by FAO, which measures the percent of cropland in each district in each season, which fails due to droughts. When we regress that on the rainfall measure, we find a very strong effect. So let me explain this table for you. The relative rainfall measure will be 0.9 in the year with the most rain in a decade, and it will be 0.1 in the year with the least rain in a decade, well, in expectation, that is. Going from the year with the most rain in a decade to the year with the least rain in a decade, that's a change of 0.1. No, 0.8, sorry. The impact of that is a reduction in the crops of about 23%, which is about a standard deviation of the percentage of failed cropland. So now that we know that it's relevant, we can merge it with the income data and household characteristics. So we use interviews from the National Income and Dynamic Surveys conducted 3 times. And they also ask questions in the survey about conditions in the past, so that we can trace household composition, work status, and household income back to 2006. And since they also ask about economic events between surveys, we can make an approximation of the income each month from 2006 to 2012. We log this monthly income, and then we control for household fixed effects, so that we only compare the same household across time and do not make any comparison across households. We entered the relative rain from the last rainy season and a time control. So these are some very preliminary results. Notice there are no standard errors, because standard errors need to be bootstrapped, and we haven't gotten to that yet. But the finding is that going from the year with the most rain in a decade to the year with the least rain in a decade will reduce the income of female-headed households by about 4%. And this is about twice the size of the impact on male-headed households. If you look at it by demographic headship and working headship, the most vulnerable groups seems to be the demographic heads, and that was expected, as not all of these work. So for further work, we want to assess whether these female-headed households are more vulnerable just because they are poor, or whether they are more vulnerable due to these other mechanisms that I mentioned. We also want to compare the vulnerability along this dimension to vulnerability along other dimensions, such as urban-rural divide, ethnicity, age, and disability. And we also want to interact these effects and see if there are particular groups of female-headed households that are more vulnerable. We also want to turn the question around a bit and look at whether the climate variability is causing more female households, or is in any way related to the formation or breakup of households. So yeah, thank you for the attention, and I'll take questions.
Questions? Yes. Thanks, Martin. I like your talk, and I like the way you're going about answering your question with the statistical model. Just a quick question: why do you choose a gamma distribution for rainfall?
Good question. Yeah. Rainfall is typically left skewed in the distribution. So there are more points close to the bottom of the distribution than close to the top of the distribution. So if you take a normal distribution of that, which would be the alternative, then then you'll have sort of fewer droughts and more floods. So this gamma distribution is similar to the normal distribution, but it takes into account that there's a different shape of the distribution.
Why gamma over log?
I guess log can also be used. I know Berkey, and there are other studies using this gamma distribution, but that's a good comment. I think log can also be used, and I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, Martin, nice presentation. I would like to hear more about your third point, that does climate variability causes creation of more female-head households.
Yeah.
So could you elaborate, please? Will you elaborate a little bit on that? What conclusion do you expect? And if it is so, why it is so?
Yeah.
What are the possible causes for this variation?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, what the sort of preliminary results show is that this climate variability does affect income, right, as a starting point. And one can also then think that in a household that experiences a drop in income, that there will be more fighting between the partners and a breakup. Maybe someone will get married and move out to a new household because there's less income in the household where they're from, right? So that's the sort of stories that we have in mind, which can affect household formation. And that is interesting, and that will be a separate study. The results that the main analysis is, however, not biased due to this formation, because we only use the formation in 2006, and then sort of freeze the household composition from 2006 and follow the same household then over the time.
What I believe is the formation of any household depends upon the demographic socioeconomic conditions rather than this climate variability. But it's good if we get some idea about that.
Yeah,
well,
that's actually what I expect. I don't expect that we'll find much, but it'd be interesting if we find it.
Thank you.
What female-headed households?
Yeah, Martin. I just want to know, what's the source of data, and how reliable is the source of data?
So the main source of data which we have used so far is the National Income Dynamics survey conducted by the University of the Cape Town. And that's recorded 3 times, and they've made quite some effort of seeking households between rounds. So attrition levels are quite low, below 10%. This is quite good, actually, that they've sort of really went after the households that were difficult to reach. But yes, there are definitely data issues, and I think a very nice thing about South Africa as a case is that there are also other data sources. We have census data from 2001 and 2011, and then we have yearly surveys, the general household surveys, every year with a much bigger sample than what we use in this panel data. So we can check against those larger samples and better and better screenshots of the populations that we have from the census data and the general household surveys.
Last question from the... Yeah, good.
Thank you, Martin. You mentioned that the term female-headed households might be, or can be criticized somehow. What might be an alternative? I mean, I think you can argue to focus on that, but I mean, I'm just interested if there would be an alternative.
Yeah, thanks. So what we're using is sort of an alternative. It's not the head of household as reported by the household themselves. So we don't use that at all, actually, what the household says is the head. We only use these sort of objective criteria to determine the female head. But the option would be to look at single adult households, where there's just one adult, to look at widowed households, to sort of look at different household structures in that fashion, and then possibly look at gender separately from that. But I think, being female and being the only female in a household is possibly different from being the only male in a household. And being the only female in a household is possibly different from being a woman in a household with a man. So that's the good thing about this concept, I think, that it captures this interlinkage. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Martin. It's very interesting. I don't know if it is a comment or a question, I don't know. But I think it will be again more interesting if there will be a possibility to test those sources of data by means of maybe in future research, maybe conducting a field work to test what the document are saying and then what is people's opinion. That will help to confirm your hypothesis. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's also useful. And the two case studies that have been conducted here in South Africa is something that we will use a lot for more of the mechanisms.
That's why I'm saying those studies have been conducted by people. So those people are not perfect.
Yeah.
You know, if we can take it from epistemological point of view. So we have to assess them with a critical eyes. That's what I'm saying. It's good. They've been material, but it's good to test them. How?
I will allow two last questions, and then you can take them together. Just quick questions, and then you answer them together.
Thank you, Martin, for your presentation. My question is, you were studying like South Africa as a whole, but for example, for rainfall and like some correlated data, if you perhaps look at different places, like municipalities, or like a smaller scale analysis, if the results could change a little bit, because perhaps you would have like some higher correlation of rainfall or something with certain parts of the country. So it's just, I don't know if you are taking that in account, or if that could be done later too. Like, what do you think on this?
Thanks, Martin. I was just wondering about this agricultural stress index. If you know, if you differentiated between which crops were more likely to be vulnerable to droughts, and I mean talking about rainfall and whatever, but particular strains of droughts, or I mean crops.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So it will definitely be interesting to look at this in different regions, and there are many ways to divide this. But the fact that it rains more or less in one area, or that there's more or less variability in rainfall in one area or the other, it does not bias our results because we use this relative measure of rainfall. To this, the index, definitely it's different crops will have different different vulnerability. The nice thing about this measure is that it uses satellite images of greenness, and it uses some temperature in a model to estimate this. And since it uses this greenness scale, it actually takes into account the differences between crops in that way.
Again?
Thank you.
Now, our program is going to be concluded by Mrs. Moipone Litsie from the University of the Witwatersrand, and she's going to talk to us about household vulnerability to natural hazards in southwestern Lesotho, impact in coping strategies. Moipone.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. In this study, I intend to provide an insight into the importance of understanding how the demographic characteristics of a household combine to influence its vulnerability to different natural hazards. So as an introduction, we all know that we are experiencing climate change, and there are negative impacts associated with climate change, and this have been reported as increasing. That there are changes in average temperatures and rainfall, as well as the intensity, the timing, and the geographic distribution of rainfall, which has resulted in the increases in the frequency of extreme climatic events such as droughts and floods. And this impact have great effects on the agricultural productivity, the biodiversity, and the ecosystems, as well as the livelihoods, especially in natural dependent communities such as Lesotho, where most of the households are already vulnerable. So my definition of vulnerability in this study is the characteristics of a household that influences their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impacts of natural hazards. Also, the coping strategies are those initiatives that are engaged by households to respond to the impacts of natural hazards. And then adaptation strategies are more of long-term measures. And natural hazards, like I said, are the extreme events. So the aim of this study is to investigate the demographic differentials in adaptation and coping strategies to natural hazards. I have three objectives. The first one is to analyze the impacts of natural hazards on households. The second one is to identify the coping and adaptation strategies to the impacts of natural hazards. The last one is to identify the differences in demographic variables, more especially gender and education level, in terms of the livelihoods and natural hazard impact, as well as the coping strategies. The data that was used in this study was household surveys, which were conducted in 23 community councils in southwestern Lesotho. And we interviewed 314 households. About 60% were males and 41% females. And the questionnaire consisted of different sections. The first one was on the demographics, then hazard occurrence between 2010 and 2012, the impacts of those hazards and the coping and adaptation strategies that were employed by the households as a response to those hazards. And we also used climatic data, both instrumental and historical. So that is my study area. It's in the southwestern part of Lesotho. This study area was of particular interest to me because it is regarded as the most vulnerable in the country because of its topography. For instance, the topography ranges from 1,400 to over 3,000 meters above sea level. This topography and also influences the climatic conditions in this area, which is characterized by lack of rainfall. And however, the majority of households in this area are dependent on agriculture. So moving on, the impacts of natural hazards. Over the years, there have been sort of disasters, natural disasters in the study area. And the most impacted sector was agriculture, mainly failure in crops as well as livestock. Many livestock were killed. And then there was also a significant proportion of human lives that were lost in the past 187 years. However, there's been increase in these hazards. So this is just the pictorial, from the pictures you can see that the agriculture here, most fields were submerged during the floods, and also infrastructure was affected. And also in the highlands, many communities are cut off from the rest of the country during heavy snowfall. And also many houses have been blown away by the strong winds. So moving on to the third objective, which looks at the demographic factors and how they influence the livelihood choices, coping strategies, and adaptation strategies by households. For this particular presentation, I'll only concentrate on gender and education. Okay, sorry. So from this graph, we can see that more females than males are engaged in casual jobs, informal trading, whereas more males than females are engaged in farming and semi-skilled jobs such as building and crafts. So on the experience of different genders and their experience with natural hazards, more women are affected by these multi-hazards. As you can see that in the red color representing women, their percentages are quite high. And moving on to the impacts of these hazards, men, as they are mainly engaged in agricultural activities, they've been having poor crop yields, and they also reported that they have exhausted their savings. This is likely because men are more engaged in farming and they also have more economic resources in terms of savings. So moving on to the coping strategies, more females than males, they engage in eating less, sharing food, and relying on donor support, as well as changing occupation after the natural hazards, whereas men sell their seeds for the next season. And on the coping strategies, women do less in terms of coping and adaptation strategies, as you can see from the different bars. And in terms of education, people with post-primary education are engaged in semi-skilled crafts, while the other groups are engaged more in casual jobs, farming, and informal trading. So moving on to the coping strategies and education, post-primary education, people with post-primary education experience less hazards. This is likely because they are likely to have access to early warning information as compared to people with no education. So in terms of education and coping strategies, people with primary education sold their seats and changed their jobs than the other groups. And also on adaptation, people with post-primary education had more coping and adaptive strategies in place as compared to the other group. So in the nutshell, we can see that natural hazards are recurring and they're having great impacts on households, and women are mostly dependent on casual jobs, and while men were more dependent on farming and semi-skilled jobs. And selling of seeds is more common amongst the males, whereas sharing food, eating less, and donor support were more common among female-headed households. And from these results, we can see that there's a significantly higher proportion of males than females who have mitigation and adaptation strategies in place. This is likely because males have more access to economic resources, and also more educated households than uneducated households have adaptation and mitigation strategies in place already. And for the next, from now on, I'll be doing a logic regression analysis to test the relationship between the dependent and independent variables. Thank you very much.
Questions for Muiponi?
Thanks, my point. I think you kind of answered like when you said like where you're thinking for future, because just based on the graphs, I think you didn't have much time to do like a deep statistical analysis. So my question was connected with what kind of approach you would think like to select which things are more important, which differences are really the more significant. So you just said something. Some tests that you are going to use, but if you have some other comments on that.
Yeah, basically, for the dependent variables, I'll do the hazard impact coping strategies, and for the independent ones, it will be gender and education. Yeah, I didn't have enough time. And I must confess, I'm a geographer, so doing a demographic analysis was a bit hectic for me.
Thank you. But you have a good set of data sets, so I think we'll be fine.
Hi, thanks, Maponi. I was just wondering what I think you mentioned earlier some warning systems in place for some of these hazards. Warning.
As in yellow warning systems. Yeah.
If what existing warning systems are there for these natural disasters?
Okay, normally, for instance, if there's there's a likelihood of heavy snowfall, the message is normally transmitted through the radio and also through the local newspapers. So educated people are likely to access that information than uneducated ones.
Emmanuel?
Thanks, Maponi. Just go back to your last slide, your conclusion where you say the second last point, significantly higher proportion of males from the graphs. That's what you said. That's what you found. I want to know which statistical model you used to analyze the data and at what significance level, confidence interval, and why did you choose that confidence interval? That alpha level.
I'm here to do those. These ones were just simple cross tabulations.
So when you say significantly higher proportion of males, you're just looking at you're just observing in the graphs.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because normally, when you bring in the word significantly, then you have to bring in the alpha level.
Isn't it's evident that it's there. Maybe I used a wrong word here.
Oh, all right. Okay, it's okay.
Any other question? Can we thank Miponi again? And this, in essence, brings us to the end of the program. And I think yesterday I made some remarks about my impression about your presentations, and I'm not going to repeat those points. But I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate you or to commend you for taking the time to prepare your talks and for your very nice presentations. I hope we have learned from one another, and I hope we will improve wherever we were lacking in our future presentation. And one thing that I would like to make a special appeal to both students and supervisors is to try and speed up the process of data acquisition and analysis. I think most of you are lagging behind. So I want to make a very special appeal to you to make sure that at least you speed up the process of data acquisition and analysis to conclude your program on time. There's just one thing that I noted that I want to point out from Shirley's presentation in terms of her organization of slides. I think her slides were very busy, congested with a lot of information. And because of that, she was tempted to try and explain everything, and then that took too much of her time. So I think Shirley should try to avoid congesting your slides with information. And even if you have, maybe if it is unavoidable for you to do that, to have that congested slides, you can just avoid trying to explain everything. You can just give us an overview of what is happening. Then in that time, you will save time. I mean, in that case, you will save time. I'm not sure if there is any announcement from Priscilla or from the student reps. Then you are dismissed. I think it's lunchtime. Thank you so much.